She lined her shack with dry cornstalks. Tobias Rensler, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, told her plainly, "You'll watch those babies freeze before Christmas, and there's nothing that Scarecrow House can do about it." She had $9, 3 children under 7, and needed 8 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. But 4 months earlier, Alma Brindstrom had never stacked a single cord of firewood in her life. She arrived in Gerald County, Dakota Territory, in the second week of September, 1887, with $9 in coin, 3 children under 7 years old, and a dead husband's name on a homestead claim. The land office clerk in Wessington Springs looked at her like she was already a ghost. "Mrs. Brindstrom," he said, sliding the paperwork across the counter, "you understand what you're taking on here? Your husband filed this claim in August. He built a shelter. He died 2 weeks later. You're inheriting a tar paper shack 12 miles from town, and winter's coming." Alma signed her name. Her English was rough, her handwriting rougher. She had learned to write in a schoolhouse in Norway that no longer existed. "The claim is mine now," she said. "By law." The clerk shrugged. "By law, yes. By December, we'll see." The wagon ride took most of a day. Carl, her oldest at 6 years, sat beside her holding the reins while she nursed the baby. Ingrid, 4 years old, slept in the wagon bed among the flour sacks and the single trunk that held everything they owned. The milk cow tied to the back lowed with every rut in the road. When they crested the final rise and Alma saw the claim for the first time, she understood what the clerk had meant. The shack stood alone on the flat prairie like a mistake someone had forgotten to correct. 12 feet by 14 feet of rough-cut boards, tar paper nailed over the exterior, a single window covered with oiled cloth, a stovepipe poking through the roof at an angle that suggested the man who installed it had been in a hurry, or sick, or both. Eric had built this. Her husband of 7 years, dead now 3 weeks, buried in a churchyard in Minneapolis she would likely never see again. He had come ahead to file the claim and build the shelter while she waited with the children. He had written one letter. "The land is good," he wrote. "The house will need work." The house needed more than work. The house needed to not exist. Alma climbed down from the wagon. The September wind cut through her dress like it wasn't there. She walked to the shack and pressed her hand against the wall. The boards flexed. She could see daylight through the gaps where they met. Inside was worse. The single room held a cast-iron stove, a rope bed frame with no mattress, a rough table, 2 stools, and nothing else. The walls were bare boards from the inside, too. She could see the tar paper through the cracks. In one corner, frost had already formed on an exposed nail head, though the temperature outside was merely cool, not cold. Carl appeared in the doorway, holding Marta. The baby was fussing. "Mama," he said, "is this our house?" Alma looked at her son. She looked at the walls that would not hold heat. She looked at the stove that was too small. She thought about the $9 in her pocket and the 5 months of winter ahead. "Yes," she said, "this is our house." The neighbor arrived 3 days later. Tobias Rensler rode up on a draft horse the color of mud, his beard gray, and his eyes the pale blue of someone who had seen too many winters. He was 54 years old, German by birth, and he had homesteaded this stretch of Dakota since 1876. He had buried 2 wives, the first to childbirth, the second to the winter of 1880, the one they called the hard winter, when blizzards raged from October to April and the trains stopped running and people burned furniture to stay alive. He dismounted slowly, the way old men do when their joints have predictions to make about the weather. He studied Alma's shack for a long moment before he spoke. "You're the widow." "I am Alma Brindstrom." I know who you are. I warned your husband about this structure, told him it wouldn't hold through January. Rensselaer walked to the wall and pressed his hand against it, just as Alma had done. Single-board construction, no chinking. Tar paper on the outside does nothing when the wind finds the gaps, and it will find them. I will seal the gaps. With what? You'd need proper lumber to build an interior wall, plaster to seal it, and 8 cords of firewood to keep that stove burning through the winter. Minimum. Probably 10. He turned to face her. You have money for lumber? Some. How much? Alma hesitated. $9. Rensselaer laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man watching someone step off a cliff. $9. Lumber alone would cost $40. Coal to supplement the wood, another $30. You can't afford materials and you can't cut timber yourself. The nearest trees worth felling are along the James River, 9 miles east. Do you have a horse? A milk cow. A milk cow. He shook his head. Mrs. Brinstrom, I've survived 11 Dakota winters. I've buried people who had more than you and knew more than you and still froze to death in their beds. A widow with 3 children can't cut timber, can't haul coal, can't survive what's coming. He pointed at her children who were watching from the doorway. Carl held Ingrid's hand. Marta was strapped to Alma's back. You'll watch those babies freeze before Christmas, and there's nothing that Scarecrow House can do about it. Alma felt the words land like stones. She felt her children's eyes on her. What do you suggest? She asked. Go back to wherever you came from. Minneapolis, wasn't it? Find work. Find a husband. This claim isn't worth your life. This claim is all I have. Rensselaer mounted his horse. Then I'm sorry for your children, he said. I'll check on you in October, if you're still alive. He rode away without looking back. For 2 weeks, Alma tried to solve the problem the way Rensselaer expected her to solve it. She walked the 8 miles to Wessington Springs and back, asking about work. There was none that would pay enough. She asked about credit at the general store. The clerk looked at her dress, her accent, her 3 children, and shook his head. She tried cutting firewood from a stand of scrub cottonwood 3 miles north. After 4 hours of work, her hands blistered and bleeding, she had produced perhaps 1/20th of a cord. At that rate, she would need 320 hours to cut the 8 cords Rensselaer said she needed. That was 40 full days of labor, and she had perhaps 60 days before hard winter arrived. 60 days in which she also needed to tend children, preserve what little food she had, seal the gaps in the walls, and not die. The math did not work. The math could not work. She lay awake at night, listening to the wind test the walls, and she did the calculations over and over. $9, 3 children, 8 cords of wood she could not cut, $40 of lumber she could not buy, 5 months of winter she could not survive. And then, in the first week of October, everything changed. The Hendricks family had given up in August. Their claim was 2 miles north of Alma's, and they had left behind a failed corn crop, a collapsed chicken coop, and 2 acres of standing cornstalks that no one had bothered to harvest. The husband had caught fever. The wife had lost the baby she was carrying. They packed what they could in a wagon and headed back to Illinois, leaving everything else to rot. Alma went to salvage what she could. Fuel, mainly. Cornstalks burned fast but hot, and everyone on the plains knew that when you had nothing else, you burned corn. You burned twisted prairie grass. You burned buffalo chips. You burned whatever would catch fire and hold it long enough to cook a meal or warm a room. She was gathering stalks when she noticed the cross-section. A stalk had broken in her hands, and she found herself staring at the inside. The outer rind was dense and woody, but the center, the pith, was something else entirely. Spongy, chambered, full of tiny pockets, each one sealed, each one containing nothing but air. Alma held the broken stalk up to the light. She could see through the chambers, barely. The structure reminded her of something. She closed her eyes, and she was 8 years old again, standing in her grandmother's cottage in Norway. The walls were thin planks, like her shack here, but between those planks and the interior, her grandmother had stuffed dried moss and heather, packed tight in bundles. The air holds the warmth, her grandmother had told her. Trap the air and it cannot move. Still air is warm air. Alma opened her eyes. She looked at the cornstalk in her hand. She looked at the field of standing stalks around her, thousands of them, free for the taking, each one full of trapped air. Her grandmother's walls had been stuffed with moss. There was no moss here, but there was corn. Corn by the acre, left to rot because no one wanted it. Alma began to calculate differently. The plan took shape over the next 3 days. She would build a false wall inside her shack, a second layer of boards set 4 inches away from the exterior wall. Between the 2 layers, she would pack dried cornstalk bundles, standing vertically, pressed tight. The stalks would trap air in their chambers. The air would not move. The warmth from the stove would stay inside instead of bleeding through the single-board walls. It was an insane idea. She knew it was insane. Rensselaer had survived 11 winters, and he said she would die. Who was she to think she knew better? But the logic held. Air trapped in small chambers resisted heat. That was why her grandmother's cottage stayed warm. That was why a wool coat kept you warmer than a cotton one. The wool fibers trapped more air. The principle was the same, only the material was different. She needed lumber for the false wall. She had no money for lumber. But the Hendricks place also had a collapsed barn, and collapsed barns had salvageable boards. 3 miles round trip, heavy loads, multiple days of work, but possible. Possible if she started immediately. She needed cornstalk bundles. She estimated 3,000 stalks to fill the wall cavities properly. At 200 stalks per trip, all she could carry with Marta on her back, that was 15 trips, 2 miles each way, 30 miles of walking total just for the harvest. She needed time. October was half gone. Hard freeze could come any day. She might have 6 weeks. She might have 4. She did not tell Rensselaer about her plan. She did not tell anyone. She simply began. Nora Rensselaer found her a week later. Tobias Rensselaer's 3rd wife was 31, originally from Iowa, practical in the way that farm women learn to be practical. She had come to check on the widow, her husband's orders, Alma suspected, and she found Alma stacking cornstalk bundles against the east wall of the shack. "What are you doing?" Alma wiped sweat from her face. Her hands were raw. Her back ached. "Insulating." "With cornstalks?" "Yes." Nora stepped closer. She examined the work in progress. The false wall frame was up. Salvaged boards from the Hendricks barn, nailed to the floor and ceiling. The cavity was 4 inches deep. Already the bottom 2 feet were filled with cornstalk bundles, packed tight. "Alma," Nora said carefully, "cornstalks are fuel. You burn them. Every bundle you pack in there is a bundle you can't burn when the stove goes cold." "I know. What happens when you run out of real fuel? You'll have walls full of kindling you can't reach." Alma stopped working. She faced Nora. "How much wood does your husband burn in a winter?" 7, 8 cords. "Why?" "I cannot cut 7 cords. I cannot buy 7 cords. But if these walls hold warmth the way I think they will, I may only need 3. I can gather 3 cords of chips and grass and corn by December. I cannot gather 7. Nora shook her head slowly. "You're gambling your children's lives on a theory about corn." I'm gambling their lives on the only theory I have. Nora stayed for an hour. She helped bundle stalks without being asked. When she left, she said nothing encouraging, but she also did not tell Alma to stop. Garrett Lund arrived the following week. He owned the quarter section adjacent to Alma's claim. He was 42, unmarried, and he had been eyeing the Brindstrom land since Eric died. The water access on Alma's claim was better than his. If she failed to prove up, if she abandoned the claim or froze to death trying to hold it, the land would revert to available status. Lund had made no secret of his intention to file on it the moment it was free. He rode up on a bay gelding and surveyed her work. The east wall was finished now. The north wall was half-packed with stalks. The exterior looked ridiculous, lumpy with bundles, dried corn leaves poking out at odd angles. "What in God's name is this?" Lund asked. "Some kind of scarecrow fort?" Alma did not stop working. "It's insulation. It's kindling waiting for a spark." He dismounted and walked closer. "Mrs. Brindstrom, I'm speaking to you as a Christian neighbor. Those children deserve better than to burn to death in a corn house. Pack them up and get them somewhere safe before it's too late." "I appreciate your concern." "I'm serious. This claim isn't worth their lives. I'll even help you load the wagon. The land will be fine. I'll see to it myself." Alma straightened. She met his eyes. "Mr. Lund, you've been waiting for me to leave since the day I arrived. You want this claim. Everyone knows you want this claim. If you want to help me gather stalks. Otherwise, ride back to your own quarter and wait. We'll see who files on what comes spring." Lund's face reddened. He mounted his horse without another word and rode away. He did not look back. In town the following Sunday, Alma heard what he'd been saying. "The widow has gone mad with grief. She's building a fire trap and putting her children inside. Someone should intervene before she kills them all." No one intervened. No one helped either. Alma worked alone. October became November. The temperature dropped. The first snow fell and melted. The second snow stayed. Alma worked 16-hour days. She rose before dawn to bundle stalks by lamplight. She walked to the Hendricks place and back, filling a makeshift sled she'd built from the chicken coop wreckage. She hauled boards from the collapsed barn. She nailed the false wall frame. She packed bundles until her arms shook, then packed more. Carl helped where he could. He held boards steady while she nailed. He carried small bundles. He kept Ingrid occupied so Alma could work. He was 6 years old, and he was already learning what labor cost. Ingrid watched with solemn eyes. Sometimes she handed her mother a cornstalk. Sometimes she cried for reasons she couldn't explain. Alma held her briefly, then went back to work. Marta rode on Alma's back, strapped in a sling day after day. She learned to sleep through hammering. She learned to nurse while her mother nailed boards. She was 18 months old, and she had already seen more work than most children see in a lifetime. Progress came in numbers Alma tracked obsessively. October 14th, 1,000 stalks harvested. East wall cavity ready. October 21st, east wall complete. First test. Temperature at dawn, 42 degrees inside, 31 outside. 11 degrees of difference with only embers in the stove. Alma stared at the thermometer she'd traded sewing work to obtain. 11 degrees. The single completed wall was holding heat. Not much, but more than the bare boards had ever held. October 28th, north wall complete. Temperature at dawn, 44 degrees inside, 29 outside, 15 degrees of difference. The gap was widening. November 4th, south wall complete. Temperature at dawn, 46 degrees inside, 24 outside, 22 degrees. The insulation was working. And then, November 7th, everything nearly collapsed. Ingrid woke with fever. Alma heard the coughing first, a wet rattle in her daughter's chest that meant infection. By noon, Ingrid was burning to the touch. By evening, she wouldn't eat. Alma had no medicine. The nearest doctor was in Huron, 40 miles away. She had what her grandmother had taught her: cold compresses, broth, prayers, and time. For 2 days, Alma did not work on the walls. She held her daughter. She watched the fever rise and fall. She listened to the wind outside and thought about the west wall, still unfinished, still open to whatever winter would bring. On the morning of November 9th, Ingrid's fever broke. The girl ate a few spoonfuls of broth. She asked for her doll. Alma wept with relief for 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. She worked through that night. Carl held a lantern while she framed the west wall in darkness, the most complex section because it contained the door and the single window. She nailed boards by feel when her eyes blurred with exhaustion. She packed bundles by moonlight when the lantern oil ran low. By dawn on November 10th, the west wall framing was complete. By sunset, it was packed with stalks. By midnight, the gaps were sealed with creek mud. Only the ceiling remained. November 6th, Nora Rensler appeared with food: a jar of preserved peaches, 2 loaves of bread. She held them out without speaking. "I can't take charity," Alma said. "Then don't call it charity. Call it trade. You said you'd sew me a winter coat, the blue wool I showed you." "That's a week's work. 2 jars and 2 loaves for a full winter coat. That's fair trade." Alma looked at the food. She looked at her children. Carl was watching, trying not to show how hungry he was. Ingrid was still recovering, still thin from the fever. Marta was nursing less because Alma herself had barely eaten in days. "Fair trade," Alma said. She took the jars. She took the bread. "I'll have the coat done by Christmas." Nora nodded. "Tobias doesn't know I'm here. He says I shouldn't encourage foolishness." She paused. "But I saw your thermometer readings. 15 degrees of difference with just the north wall finished. That's not foolishness." "What is it?" "I don't know yet. But if it works, I want to know how you did it." She left. Alma fed her children real food for the first time in 4 days. That night, she slept without nightmares. November 18th. The ceiling was done. The interior partition was built. The work was complete. Alma stood in the center of her shack and looked at what she had made. The walls bulged with bundles. Cornstalk leaves poked through gaps in the mud ceiling. The interior space was smaller now, 10 feet by 12 feet instead of the original 12 by 14, because she'd walled off a section for cold storage, reducing the volume she needed to heat. From outside, the structure looked absurd, lumpy, crooked, a child's drawing of a house built by someone who had never seen a house. From inside, at 6 in the morning, with only banked embers in the stove, the thermometer read 44 degrees. Outside, it was 19 degrees. 25 degrees of difference, with almost no fire burning. Alma had done the calculations. Tobias Rensler's log cabin, 6 inches of solid wood, burned 7 to 8 cords of fuel each winter. Based on her temperature readings and fuel consumption over the past 3 weeks, she estimated she would need perhaps 3 to 4 cords, maybe less. She had 2.5 cords gathered. Buffalo chips, twisted grass, a small amount of coal she'd bought with her last $4. Not enough for a normal winter, but possibly, enough for a winter in a house that held heat. She stood at the window and watched the snow fall. The cornstalk walls stood thick and strange around her. The children slept in a room that was 44 degrees with no fire. Tobias Rensler had said she would watch her babies freeze before Christmas. Christmas was 5 weeks away. and the temperature inside her absurd, impossible scarecrow house had not dropped below 40 degrees in a week. But winter hadn't truly arrived yet. The skeptics were waiting. Rensselaer rode by every few days, studying her cabin with an expression she couldn't read. Lund had stopped visiting, but she knew he was watching from his claim, waiting for smoke to stop rising from her chimney. She had built something. She believed it would work. But believing was not knowing, and winter on the Dakota Plains did not care what anyone believed. Somewhere to the northwest, beyond the horizon, beyond the next ridge, a weather system was building. The largest cold front of the decade was gathering strength over Montana, preparing to sweep southeast across the plains at 45 miles per hour, dropping temperatures faster than anyone had ever measured. Alma Brindstrom did not know it was coming. No one did. She banked the fire, checked the children, and went to sleep in a house made of corn. And outside, the temperature began to fall. The weeks between Thanksgiving and New Year passed in a rhythm of fire and measurement. Every morning, Alma checked the thermometer before she checked the children. Every morning, the numbers held. Outside, 15 degrees, 8 degrees, -2. Inside, 41, 39, 36. The gap stayed wide. The walls held. December brought deeper cold. On the night after Christmas, the temperature dropped to -18 degrees. Alma stayed awake, feeding the stove, watching the thermometer needle as if it might betray her. By dawn, the interior had fallen to 31 degrees. Her breath fogged in the air. Ice filmed the water bucket, but the children slept. No one froze. The house made of corn kept them alive. She burned perhaps 2/3 of a cord that month. Nora Rensselaer mentioned during a brief visit on December 28th that they had already gone through 4 cords. Tobias says it's been a hard month, she said. He's cutting more. 4 cords in 1 month. Alma had burned 2/3 of a cord. The difference was the walls. Garrett Lund rode by on New Year's Day. He stopped at the property line and stared at the smoke rising from her chimney. He did not approach. After several minutes, he turned his horse and rode away. In the first week of January, the weather turned strange. January 11th, 1888, was warm. Alma woke to find the interior at 52 degrees with only banked embers. She opened the door and felt air that belonged to April, not January. The temperature outside was above freezing. Snow was melting. Water dripped from the roof edge in a steady patter. Carl asked if he could play outside without his coat. Alma looked at the blue sky, the melting snow, the sunshine that seemed impossible after weeks of gray. She said yes, but stay close. Marta had been fussy the night before, refusing food and crying for no clear reason. Alma assumed teething. By mid-morning, the baby felt warm to the touch. A low fever, perhaps 101 degrees. Not dangerous, but worrying. Alma kept her inside, away from the unusual warmth. By noon, the temperature had climbed into the low 40s. Alma did laundry outside for the first time since October. She hung shirts on a line she'd strung between the house and the privy. They dripped dry in the sunshine. Ingrid laughed at the water droplets falling into the snow. At 2 in the afternoon, Alma noticed the northwest sky. The color was wrong. Not gray, not white, but a kind of greenish black she had never seen before. The horizon looked bruised, and it was moving, the darkness spreading across the sky faster than clouds should move. The wind, which had been still all morning, shifted. It came from the northwest now, and it was colder than the air it replaced. 10 degrees colder, maybe more. The temperature was dropping even as she watched. Alma called for Carl. No answer. She called again, louder. The wind ate her voice. She stepped outside, and the cold hit her like a wall. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees in the time it took her to walk 3 steps. The sky to the northwest was no longer a bruise on the horizon. It was a wall, a solid white wall stretching from ground to sky, moving toward her at the speed of a running horse. Carl appeared around the corner of the shack, clutching something to his chest. "Mama? I found a bird. I think it's sick." The first gust of wind nearly knocked him down. Alma grabbed him with one hand, the bird falling forgotten into the snow. She half carried, half dragged him to the door. Behind them, the world disappeared. The white wall hit. Visibility dropped to zero in an instant. The air filled with something that was not quite snow, fine ice crystals, sharp and penetrating, driven by wind that screamed like a living thing. Alma could not see her hand in front of her face. She could not see the door that was 3 feet away. She found it by feel. She shoved Carl through. She threw herself after him. She slammed the door against 60 miles per hour of wind and jammed a chair under the handle. Inside, Ingrid was screaming. Marta was screaming. The walls were creaking like a ship in a storm. And outside, the temperature was falling faster than any temperature had ever fallen in recorded Dakota history. The blizzard hit Gerald County at 14 minutes past 2 on the afternoon of January 12, 1888. In Wessington Springs, 12 miles to the northwest, a Signal Corps weather observer named Burnley would later record that the temperature dropped 18 degrees in less than 3 minutes. The wind shifted from south to northwest instantaneously, jumping from 5 miles per hour to 60. The barometric pressure fell so fast that windows cracked from the change. At the Brinstrom claim, Alma had no instruments to measure what was happening. She had only her body, her children, and the walls she had built from corn. The first hour was chaos. Carl was crying from the cold that had caught him outside. Alma stripped his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket she could find. Ingrid clung to her leg, hysterical with fear. Marta wailed from her crib, her fever spiking from the stress. The stove was burning low. She had let it die down in the warm weather, and now she needed heat desperately. Alma loaded the stove with everything she had: wood chips, twisted grass, a precious scoop of the coal she'd been hoarding. The fire caught and built. Smoke poured back into the room as the wind pressure fought the chimney draft. She sealed the door gaps with rags. She stuffed cloth into the window frame. She pushed furniture against the walls where drafts seemed to penetrate, and she watched the thermometer. 3 o'clock, 48 degrees inside. The fire was roaring now, consuming fuel faster than she'd planned. Outside, the temperature was impossible to know. The window was solid white, ice crystals packed against the oiled cloth by wind that had not stopped screaming since the storm arrived. 4 o'clock, 46 degrees inside, falling, but slowly. The cornstalk walls were doing their work. 5 o'clock, 44 degrees. 6 o'clock, 42 degrees. The rate of decline was slowing as the interior temperature approached equilibrium with the insulation's capacity to resist heat loss. And then Marta's fever spiked. The baby had been quiet since the storm hit, which Alma had taken as a good sign. Now she realized the quiet was wrong. Marta was limp in her crib, her skin dry and hot to the touch. The fever had climbed. 103, maybe 104. Too high. Dangerously high. Alma faced an impossible choice. A fever this high needed cooling. In normal circumstances, she would undress the baby, apply cool water to wrists and forehead, open a window for fresh air. But opening anything meant death. Cool water was ice water now, dangerous in its own way. The room itself was 42 degrees, warm enough for survival in blankets, but not warm enough for an undressed baby. She needed to balance 3 incompatible requirements. Keep the room warm enough for Carl and Ingrid, keep the room cool enough for Marta's fever, and burn as little fuel as possible to stretch her supply through however many hours or days this storm lasted. She chose. She stripped Marta to her undershirt and diaper. She wrapped her in a single light blanket instead of the heavy wool. She placed her between Carl and Ingrid on the bed, using their body heat to provide warmth without overheating. She watched the baby's face for signs of shivering or distress. Then she went back to managing the fire. 8 o'clock. Full darkness had fallen hours ago, but Alma only knew it from the clock. The window showed nothing but white. The sound had not changed. A constant roar, punctuated by gusts that made the walls flex inward. Inside, 39 degrees. Outside, according to what she would learn later, the temperature had dropped to minus 25. The cornstalk walls were holding a 64-degree difference. Alma calculated fuel consumption. She had burned perhaps an eighth of a cord in 6 hours, roughly twice her normal rate, but sustainable. She had enough fuel inside the shack to last another 24 hours at this pace. Maybe 36 if she reduced the fire once the immediate crisis passed. The question was, how long could the storm last? Marta's fever seemed stable, not lower, but not higher. The baby slept fitfully between her siblings. Carl had stopped shivering and was asleep. Ingrid sucked her thumb, a habit she'd abandoned months ago, and watched the fire with eyes that didn't blink. At 9:30, Alma heard a sound above the wind, a different kind of creaking. She looked up. The ceiling was sagging. Snow was accumulating on the roof faster than she had imagined possible. The weight was pressing down on the planks she'd laid over the cornstalk ceiling insulation. If the roof collapsed, the insulation would be breached. The cold would pour in. Everything she had built would fail in an instant. She could not go outside to clear the roof. She could not reinforce the ceiling from inside without tools she didn't have. She could only watch and wait and pray that the salvaged planks from the Hendricks barn were strong enough to bear whatever weight the storm chose to place on them. The creaking continued. The sagging increased. Alma stared at the ceiling for 2 hours, waiting for it to fall. It did not fall. At midnight, the creaking stopped. Either the snow accumulation had reached equilibrium, or the wind was now stripping snow from the roof as fast as it deposited. She would never know. She only knew that the ceiling held. 2 in the morning, the deepest part of the night. Inside, 34 degrees. Water had frozen in the bucket near the door, but the bucket near the stove remained liquid. The children slept in a pile under every blanket Alma owned. Marta's fever had broken sometime around midnight. The baby was nursing weakly but steadily, her skin cooler to the touch. Outside, the temperature had fallen to minus 38 degrees. Alma fed the fire and did the math. At minus 38 degrees exterior and 34 degrees interior, her 4 inches of cornstalk insulation was holding a temperature difference of 72 degrees. The fuel consumption was high but sustainable. The children were alive. At this moment, 2.5 miles to the southeast, the Rensler family was not faring as well. Tobias Rensler had more fuel than Alma. He had a larger stove. He had 6-inch log walls instead of thin boards packed with corn. But log walls, solid softwood, R value of 1.41 per inch, could not match the dead air insulation of cornstalk pith at R2 to R2.5 per inch. By 2 in the morning, the interior of the Rensler cabin had fallen to 28 degrees. Tobias was burning fuel at triple his normal rate. His wife and 2 children huddled against the stove, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing they owned, while frost formed on the interior walls. They would survive, but barely, and they would remember. In Wessington Springs, the situation was worse. Several frame buildings lost heat entirely when fires could not keep pace with the cold. Families gathered in the general store, where a larger stove and multiple fuel sources maintained something close to survivable temperature. The old man who lived alone in a board shack at the edge of town ran out of fuel at midnight. He was found 3 days later, frozen in his bed. On the prairie between Wessington Springs and the Brindstrom claim, a teenage boy was walking home from school when the storm hit. He was 13 years old, familiar with the land, confident he could make the 2 miles to his family's farm. His body was discovered the following week, 40 yards from the barn. He had been unable to find it in the whiteout. He had frozen to death within sight of safety. None of this was known to Alma as she sat by her stove at 2 a.m, watching her children sleep. She knew only what she could see, the fire burning, the walls holding, the temperature inside her absurd cornstalk house staying above freezing while the worst blizzard in Dakota history raged outside. She did not sleep. She fed the fire every 30 minutes. She checked Marta's temperature by touch. She listened to the wind, waiting for any change that might signal the storm's end. At 5 a.m, the fire burned lower than she intended. She had dozed off sitting up, her head dropping to her chest for just a moment. When she jerked awake, the interior temperature had dropped to 32 degrees. Ice filmed the bucket near the stove. Ingrid was whimpering in her sleep. Alma threw fuel on the fire with shaking hands. She blew on the embers. She prayed in Norwegian, words she hadn't spoken since childhood. The fire caught. The flames built. The temperature began to climb. By 7 a.m, the interior was back to 36 degrees. Outside, the wind had not stopped, but the quality of the sound was different, less frantic, more steady. The temperature, she would later learn, had peaked at -40 degrees overnight and was now beginning a slow rise. The worst had passed. The children were alive. The cornstalk walls had held. January 13th dawned white and still. The wind died sometime around 8 a.m, dropping from 60 miles per hour to nothing in a matter of minutes. The silence was so sudden that Alma thought she had gone deaf. She pressed her ear to the wall and heard only her own heartbeat. She cracked the door open. The outside world had been transformed. Snow covered everything to a depth of 5 to 6 feet. The privy was invisible. The horizon was invisible. Even the sky seemed white, a low ceiling of clouds that reflected the snow below until up and down were indistinguishable. The temperature was -28 degrees, cold but survivable. Calm. Alma closed the door. She fed the children the last of the preserved peaches Nora had brought. She checked Marta's temperature, normal. She checked Carl and Ingrid for frostbite, none. She looked at the walls she had built from corn and desperation. They had held. Tobias Rensler arrived on January 15th. It took him 4 hours to travel 2.5 miles through drifts that reached his horse's belly. His face was wind-burned, ice still clinging to his beard. He had been traveling between homesteads for 2 days, checking the living and counting the dead. Alma let him in. He stood in the middle of her 10 by 12-foot space and said nothing for a long moment. His eyes moved over the lumpy walls, the visible cornstalk bundles, the 3 children playing near a modest fire. He pulled off a glove and touched the wall. It was warm. "I told you that you'd watch those babies freeze," he said. "Yes, you did." "I was wrong." He paused. "How warm did it hold?" 32 at the lowest, 34 most of the night. 34. He shook his head slowly. "My cabin hit 28. We burned 3 days' worth of wood in one night." "I burned a quarter cord, maybe less." Rensler stared at her. He looked at the walls again. He looked at the thermometer hanging by the door. He looked at the children who were alive, who were warm, who had survived a night that killed grown men in proper cabins. "Cornstalks," he said. Cornstalks. Can you show my wife how you did it? Within a week, 3 families had visited to examine Alma's walls. Nora Rensler came first. On January 17th, she walked around the interior, touching the bundles, feeling the warmth they held. She took notes in a small book she'd brought. Bundle size, packing technique, wall cavity depth, mud ceiling. Tobias is talking about adding a layer to our walls before next winter, she said. He's looking at cornstalks, or straw. He says the principle is the same. It is. Anything that traps air in small pockets. 2 families from Wessington Springs sent representatives on January 20th. They were cautious, skeptical, but they had seen the body of the old man who froze in his board shack. They wanted to know how a widow with 3 children had survived in a structure that should have been a death trap. Alma explained. She showed them the wall cross-section where one bundle had come loose. She pointed out the mud ceiling, the false wall construction, the reduced heated volume. She did not claim to have invented anything. The air does the work, she said. I just gave it somewhere to sit still. The Huron newspaper sent a reporter in early February. Alma declined to be interviewed, but she allowed him to see the walls. The story that ran the following week called it an ingenious innovation by a resourceful widow and noted that the insulating properties of agricultural waste may merit further study. Garrett Lund never visited. He never congratulated her. He never acknowledged her survival. In March, he sold his claim and moved to Wyoming Territory. Whether he was shamed or simply saw better opportunities elsewhere, Alma never learned. His quarter section was claimed by a family from Minnesota the following year. The land adjacent to Alma's remained hers. By spring of 1889, at least 11 homesteads in Gerald County had added interior wall insulation using agricultural waste, cornstalks, wheat straw, hay, or cattail. Tobias Rensler became an unlikely advocate for the technique, demonstrating his modified straw packing method at the county fair that year. He told anyone who would listen about the night of January 12th, about his log cabin struggling at 28 degrees, while the widow's cornhouse held at 34. Alma showed 3 neighboring widows how to build the false wall frame, accepting only fabric and preserved goods in trade. She never asked for credit. She never sought recognition. My grandmother knew this in Norway, she said when asked about her inspiration. The idea is older than any of us. Alma Brindstrom proved up her homestead in 1892, receiving the official patent for 160 acres in Gerald County. She never remarried. Carl grew tall and learned the wheelwright's trade in Huron. Ingrid married a farmer from the next county. Marta, the baby who nearly died of fever during the blizzard, lived to see 80 and remembered nothing of that night except what her mother told her. Alma remained on 80 acres after selling the northern half to fund Carl's apprenticeship. She died in November of 1911 at 53 years old. The cornstalk walls were still standing. The last notation in her diary, dated 3 days before her death, read, 28 degrees outside, 41 inside. The walls hold. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. The fine, powdery snow filled lungs and froze nostrils shut. 235 people died across the Dakota Territory and Nebraska. Farmers caught between house and barn, children walking home from school, old men alone in shacks without enough fuel. Bodies were found 12 feet from front doors, 40 yards from barns, within arm's reach of safety that could not be seen. Tobias Rensler, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried 2 wives to the cold, had told Alma Brindstrom plainly in September of 1887, "A widow with 3 children can't cut timber, can't haul coal, can't survive what's coming. You'll watch those babies freeze before Christmas, and there's nothing that Scarecrow House can do about it." The Scarecrow house held at 32 degrees through the coldest night in a decade. The babies did not freeze. Alma sat awake through that night, feeding the fire, listening to 60-mile-per-hour winds testing walls made of corn. The stalks she had gathered from a failed neighbor's field, the same stalks she was supposed to burn for fuel, stood packed tight around her, trapping millions of tiny pockets of still air. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Trap the air, and it cannot move. The air held the warmth. The fire held through the night. And when the sun rose on January 13th over a world buried in white, 3 children woke up alive in a house that everyone said would kill them. The walls creaked. The wind died. Alma Brindstrom did not move from her chair by the stove for a long time. She was watching her children breathe,